Greetings, folks. Here we are back again for another Q&A session. This one's for September 2024, and I just want to start by saying we got some really good questions this month. So I appreciate that, and I love doing these. So let's get into it. I think we're going to cover 4 or 5, but the first one is really multifaceted, right? There's a lot going on, and I'm actually going to read you a good amount of what's in this question because really, this is one of the essential parts of plant spirit work, and this warrants its own class. And I think we'll do an advanced class on this in April or May of next year when the plants come back after their rest, right? So for now, let me wet your whistle a little bit. So Sharon asked, and this is in parts, this is a big question, but I'm going to address every part of it. I am getting a bit twisted up with the following, right? Herbs have virtues and energetics. We've talked about that before. If you're new to that concept, stick around, you'll figure it out. An example, yarrow can help a body work with a fever by opening pores, right? Diaphoresis, so a person can sweat out the fever. Whether a person needs this is based on their personal constitution at the time. So herb virtues and energetics get matched to the person, absolutely. Some herbs have the virtue of moistening, which can aid a person who is too dry, etc., right? And this is where we get into exceptional herbalism, right? That rather than throwing an herb at somebody because that herb is good for the lungs, we consider what the lungs of the individual person are currently like. And then we consider the herbs that have an affinity with lungs that also carry the right energetics that speak to that current lung state, right? So just because an herb is good for the lungs doesn't mean that it's good for everybody's lungs. And an example of that is when we throw a super damp respiratory herb at somebody who's experiencing a really damp, wet cough. What we do is we put an herb into their body that not only moves directly into the lungs, but actually adds dampness, so we can inadvertently drive the pathology deeper into the tissues, right? So this is where we have to start this conversation. This is a good one. But plants can, for the person in right relationship with them, do pretty much anything, okay? Energetics and virtues and constitutions go out the window. Accurate. Oak tincture, while normally astringent, might be used to loosen something up when oak works its wisdom with the wisdom of the body, because no herb is limited to what is generally known about it. So in a specific person in deep relationship with oak may do the opposite for what is known. Okay, this is incredibly poignant and very important. Again, it goes far beyond how deep we can go in this class, but I have to address this. We have to talk about it a little bit, right? And Sharon makes the ultimate point here, that if you are in a deep enough relationship with a specific plant spirit, that relationship transcends or goes beyond the specific physically oriented energetics of the plant. And that physically oriented is important because when we look at the actions and energetics shared to us by our herb-wise ancestors, they are always based in tissues. It's always based in tissue state, right? The dryness of an herb, the dampness of an herb, the astringency, the diaphoresis has everything to do with tissue states. Now, we've talked before about how that also spills over into the non-physical, right? But that's a different conversation. What Sharon is bringing up here is that when somebody's in deep relationship with the plant, it becomes the spirit of the plant that's doing the work rather than the specific physical actions and virtues. So oak being one of our champion astringent herbs, right, suddenly could loosen somebody up, or could actually bring fluidity to somebody, or could bring warmth where there is coldness, because the person's in relationship with that plant. And the reason that it happens is because when we are in deep relationship with a plant, that plant acts as doorway or access point to the wholeness of nature's wisdom, right? They are connecting us to the medicine we need. And it may not even be them that's doing the work. They may be, as one denizen of the green realm, calling on others in their group to show up and help us out, right? So there's one level. Sharon goes further. Then a third thing comes in. The relationship of a plant with a practitioner. Much the same as above, a plant can do absolutely anything, right? But it depends on the practitioner and their relationship with the plant. The person themselves becomes a minor player here because the plant helps them due to the relationship of said plant with the practitioner. So here we've gone from plants being limited to tissue states based on actions and energetics to plants being unlimited based on their relationship with a particular individual that's in relationship to them, to plants being unlimited in service of another person based on their relationship to the person giving that plant, right? So if you go see an herbalist, for example, and the herbalist gives you an herb that they are in super deep relationship, or they work that herb into a formula, their relationship with that plant allows for that plant to do things in the formula to that totally unrelated client that normally would not be possible. Then a fourth thing enters. We can go deeper. The plant heals from afar. Plant is not present in physical form, but heals anyway. Herbalists such as Matthew Wood can write the name of a plant on a piece of paper, have a person hold the paper, and get results, usually instantaneous. I'm guessing this is due to his relationship with the plants, yes, and his relationship, very special relationship with the green realm as a whole, right? He is somebody that I would say has achieved dual citizenship. He lives fully in our world and fully in their world, and so he's able to go back and forth and act as a go-between, right? So this is another thing that when we talk about plant spirits, we're being literal, right? That plants are arcane spirits who have a physical form in our world, just as you and I do. We have our physical bodies, the way we show up, but they are also spiritual beings who have the ability to be in many places at once. Every expression of a particular species of plant is the expression of one spirit. So the lavender in your garden and the lavender in my garden are giving us access to the same personality, the same person. And because of that, just like with deities, ancestors, saints, angels, whatever, we can invoke them into a space even if they're not physically present because they have that ability, right? They are rooted in the other world, which runs parallel to our own and gives an access to time and place that's different than what we have access to. So when we call them spirits, when we call them green saints, we're being quite literal. So question is this: how do we sort out the understanding of plant virtues, energetics, constitutions, etc., and matching them to the person when it appears there is another path based purely on relationships and does not use virtues, energetics, and constitutions? I feel I'm missing a link of some sort here. I know in most things it is not all or nothing. It is often both. But if one wants to focus one path or the other, what guidance should we seek? Whether to practice using energetics or to put full trust in a plant ally that would normally not be known to deal with the situation at hand or do what needs to be done. So you already hit on the most important part of this question, which is the answer is both, right? Understanding the personality of the plants through actions, virtues, and energetics, and folklore and botany, the way they grow, their morphology, how they grow, how they smell, the colors, understanding them as they show up physically is the first step in understanding them spiritually. So that's where we begin, right? We begin with how they meet us where we are, and they do that in tissue state. They do that in the physical. And then we follow that, almost like you're pulling on a thread, right? We go from being physically attracted or enamored by a plant because we love their colors or we love their shape, into learning about the folklore and the medicinal applications and the herbals, and then into the deeper actions and energetics and how they align to particular mental pictures. And then suddenly, before we know it, we're entering into a connection with the subtle part of them, the spirit of them. And that's where everything changes. So we meet them where we are, and we follow that path, and it leads us naturally, without having to stress about it, it leads us to that spiritual. The other reason that we start with actions and energetics is because it is unlikely that you will have the deep relationship with every plant you want to have a relationship with in your lifetime. It's just not possible. So what happens is we hold our plant spirit allies in one hand, those plants that we work with for deep things, we bring them into our formulas, we bring them into our healing work and all of that. But in our left hand, we hold everything we've learned folklorically, empirically, about all the herbs that we can also bring in to inform a formula or to match up with a client. In addition to spiritual herbalism, an herbalist being a go-between between the world of human and the world of plant, we're also matchmakers, right? And so since we're not going to be in deep ally relationship with every plant, we do want to know enough plants, at least on the physical level, the tissue state level, that when we meet a client or a friend or a family member or a situation in life, that we can say, oh, you know who this totally reminds me of, or who this brings up for me, is chamomile. Like, you know what I mean? We won't have that repertoire. We won't have that list of resources if we haven't studied and learned something about the way the plants have shown up ancestrally. So this is such a good question. I could go another 3 hours on this, but we'll save that for another time and wrap it up here. Sharon, thank you so much for asking this question. Heather asks, what do you do on days during a plant spirit journey when you're busy or overwhelmed? I've had to give up perfection in order to continue on with journeys, but really interested in your take and approach. So this is a fantastic question. I have an advanced class out there on the Patreon about a tour of my plant spirit journals. And we actually talk about this a lot, that I show you entries from my journal that literally read, too tired to sit today, too grumpy to sit today, right? Just not feeling it, too busy to sit today. It's totally fine, right? This isn't dogmatic. No one's going to punish you for not doing it. We do have plant spirit-based rituals that do include a ritual resolve, which we do have to follow. But when we are talking about what Heather's talking about, which if you're new to this, every month our online community sits with one plant for an entire lunar cycle from new moon to new moon. And we try to spend a little bit of time every day, or as many days as we can, sitting, connecting, learning, listening, journeying with that plant through reading about them, studying, through guided meditations and rituals that I provide, all that support this connection with the plant, right? Which ties into Sharon's question earlier, that this is how we build up that repertoire of plant friends. But sometimes you get busy, right? So get busy. Don't let your guilt, your shame, your anxiety get in the way of the next sit being as deep as it can be. And this is something that I really struggled with for a long time, that I would miss a day and would be like, man, I was like 21 days in a row on this journey, and then I missed day 22 and I feel like I screwed it up and the plants think I'm lazy. No, you know, the day is just a day. It's just a breath, right? So we go back in the next day and we pick up right where we left off. And at the end of that 29-day lunation, or however long the journey is that month, sometimes 28 days, if you're still hungry for more, then I tell people, sit again, do another month, move that herb to the morning and do 5 minutes every morning. And then whatever herb we're working on collectively, you can use that herb time in the evening. Or some people just do their own thing. That's totally cool too. There's a huge library of plants you can choose from on that group. So don't take it personally. If you go to bed at night and right as you're about to fall asleep, you're like, oh shit, I didn't do my thing tonight. I didn't go sit with juniper and smolder a little leaf and sit with that energy, or I didn't read up on the monograph, or I didn't do the 5-minute guided meditation. Do something right now. Think about juniper. Try to quiz yourself. Remember all the things you can remember about the plant. What do they look like? See how clearly you can get the plant into your vision. Maybe try to remember the actions and the energetics. Maybe try to remember a story that we talked about in the monograph, right? That counts. You did something and you get to fall asleep in that state. That's pretty cool. So excellent question. Don't beat yourself up. Next question. I know one of the best things we can do to learn the plants is to look at folklore, but I'm wondering, for plants that aren't big plants, what are some tips and tricks we can use to find that folklore? Are there any? Herbs that everyone knows and are commonly worked with, like mugwort, mint, lavender, etc., are fairly easy to find. But lately I have had a harder time finding folklore and legends of plants that I've been working with. Damiana, for instance, I can find history of use, but not necessarily folklore. It's also been nearly impossible to find information on a lot of my regional herbs, and I fear much of it has been erased with the early displacement of indigenous people on the East Coast. I understand not every herb has myths and legends associated, but do you have any tips and tricks you'd recommend to find this information? So, first things first. If a group of people has established traditions of use for a particular herb, then there is folklore somewhere, right? It may not be accessible to all of us. It might be part of close practices. It might be hidden, but the folklore is there. So let's say you live in a place where there's a native herb that's a really big part of particular indigenous groups' materia medica, part of their very important local medicine. I can guarantee you there's stories around that plant. They just might not be accessible to everybody, for one reason or another. Sometimes because we just haven't been good stewards of other people's folklore, right? We've taken it and ran with it and put a dollar sign on it. Sometimes you can approach folks with sincerity and say, I really love this plant, and I know that your community, your group of people have a really close relationship with this plant. Is there any stories you would share with me? And sometimes you get lucky, then you get something. An example with Damiana, looking at materia medica and folklore in English is probably going to bring you to dead ends. But if you start looking at materia medica and plant folklore in Spanish, you might actually find something, right? Because Damiana's folklore exists in Mexico. Like, it's there, right? It's just not as easily accessible. So there's that part of it, that sometimes the people who are protecting those stories are protecting them. And sometimes we just don't have access to them. And sometimes we just have to work a little harder to get that access and to just ask. The worst thing anyone's ever going to tell you is no. And that's okay. People can tell you no, right? So I've done it. I've been told yes. I've been told no. Yes, way more often than no, but you take the no's humbly and understand, why. So the other part of it is that sometimes plants don't have extant folklore, or it's been totally lost, or like we run into in a lot of the old European herbals, there's this really cool story about a plant. We don't know what the hell plant it is. Like, it's a name that we have no etymology around. It doesn't relate to, we've lost awareness of what name that plant actually connects to. So there's this really cool story floating around, and we don't know who it belongs to. That can be really frustrating, and more with etymological research and all that. We sometimes make new links between plant names, but generally it's when you find a dead end, it's a dead end. So this is where we journey with the plants and we ask them their stories, and we also look at how that plant has shown up for us, what's happened with us, how the journey happened, how we found them, where they led us. And we allow that to become personal folklore, right? We allow that to become the story of the journey. And that's very, very important as well. So that's about all I can say on that. Sometimes we just have to look in unexpected places or go face to face with people and reach out to folks and ask, and more often than not, somebody will share a story with you, especially if that sincerity is there, and people can feel that. Let's do one more. It might be interesting to riff on the relationship between the neologism rewild and bewilder, as these terms relate to plant spirit explorations. As someone in favor of both terms, it seems to me that bewilderment has more depth of possibilities, but allowing plants to thrive in a yard surrounded by other yards under constant attack by mowers, edgers, weed eaters, and chainsaws, droughts followed by heavy rains, etc., certainly throws us into the maelstrom of Earth's wild and infinite genius, and simultaneity of rewilding and bewilderment at the dark edges of a mad celebratory dance. This is like a very cool question too, and I think the invitation here is really meditation and contemplation. Rudolph, Rudolph said, never trust, straight lines in a garden, right? That's just not how this works. That there should be wildness, and that there should be an organic nature to things. I think about like Stephen Herod Buhner too. I think in the Imaginal Realm book talks about no line existing in nature, right? That the more you zoom in on a line, the more you realize there's texture and depth, and you can just keep zooming in forever and cutting it in half and half and half and half. And so I think about that a lot. I meditate on that a lot. This idea of rewilding and be wilder, bewilderment. We even have pagan folklore around this. Think about Pan, right? The god Pan, the forest god of music and drums and raucous behavior. That his name is literally the etymological root of our current word panic, pandemonium, right? That when we step into his domain, when we step into those spaces that are truly untamed, that have not been coerced into straight lines or plowed or bulldozed or made pretty by human standards, that we can become bewildered, we can get discombobulated, and we can panic, right? Even, old ancient stories of people living in much simpler, much wilder times, there are still stories of people wandering so far into wildness that it induces a state of panic, right? That they become bewildered, they confront wildness, and that confrontation, that terror of the threshold, for many modern people happens at the edge of the meadow and the beginning of the forest. Now we can't really even go 10 steps in without feeling that sense of otherness and of not belonging, right? Because we've removed ourselves and divorced ourselves so much from all of that. So I don't really have, I guess, a good answer here other than it's always worth meditating on sort of the human impact on the world and the preservation of wild spaces and how to move into wild spaces and allow ourselves to be bewildered, to be bewilded, rewilded, by coming in, respectfully as guests, really, to learn those ways again, to learn how to sit in those spaces and allow that panic, that wildness to flow through us until we feel at home in it. And, I know people who do some pretty wild things. They live out in the sticks, far away from humans, very much relying on the land, and even they still experience this panic, this pan-driven bewilderment of facing the uncontrolled. So much of Indo-European cosmology, which informs most of the English-speaking world at this point, is based on order and cosmetics, things fitting together in a pleasing way, things having a pleasing form as an antidote to its opposite, chaos, right? But nature is beautifully organized in the panoramic and incredibly chaotic and sometimes terrifying when we zoom in, right? And so these are just meditations, things to think about that I appreciate. So cool question. Thank you. Thank you guys so much, as always, every month for these incredible questions. I really appreciate it. Please keep them coming. And I really actually think many of these are going to get turned into Friday classes. So I get so many of my ideas and inspirations from you. So thank you. See you guys next time.